Who loves fan translations? I know I do, and I hope you do too, or else clicking on this video will be one of the many mistakes you'll make today. But hey, we can't all be perfect. That's right, today we'll be looking at all the English fan translations that made it to the PlayStation in the cursed year of 2023. This is now the third video in the series, with the previous two covering all the other fan translations on the console, but you can forget about those for now because today's all about the new kids on the block. 10 new kids on the block to be exact, a mixture of wacky deep cuts, stone cold classics, a whole bunch of tactics games, and maybe even a holy grail. If you're lucky. So if somebody out there was to ask me, Sean, when does the video start? I would say,
starts right now!
So, as always, before we dig into the games, just a quick disclaimer to let you know the 10 games we'll be looking at today are all English language translations and should be playable on both original hardware and emulation, assuming you've got the means to do either. This isn't meant to be a full review or breakdown of these games and their patches, more so just a brief introduction to let you know what the game's all about, that it exists, and it's ready to play right now. So if you like what you see, well, you know what to do. Anyway, we'll be looking at our 10 games today in alphabetical order, which means we're kicking things off with an old friend who's got a brand new facelift. Hey look, it's Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, a game you might remember from that long Namco video or maybe even the first PlayStation translation video I made. So why are we talking about it again today? Well, as it turns out, Ace Combat 3 got another fan translation in 2023, and boy, is it a doozy. And look, let's be fair, any reason I have to play Electrosphere again is a good one, so it's a win-win really. Now just to recap for those unaware, in 1999 Namco released the incredibly ambitious Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, the third game in the franchise, and one that was chock to the brim with high-quality anime cutscenes, fleshed-out story segments, over 50 unique missions with branching paths and multiple endings, and also some of the coolest visual design and UI work you will see on the console, all contained within 2 juicy PlayStation discs. Naturally, it cost a lot of money for Namco to make, and when the game didn't perform to Namco's expectations in Japan, they worried about the risk of releasing and translating such a big game that might not even have an audience in the West. So as a compromise, Namco released a cut-down version of Ace Combat 3 in the West, a game that now features none of the anime cutscenes, an entirely different story, no branching path system, and a whole bunch of other content that's just been outright removed, now on a single paltry PlayStation disc. Was it a good game? Yeah, even in its cut-down form, it's still pretty good, but compared to the complete Japanese version, it's also one of the most gimped games in the history of video games, so there you go. Of course, this made the game a prime candidate for a fan translation, and thanks to Team Nemo's work in the past, it's been playable in English for quite some time now. There were still a few areas in the patch that weren't fully translated, mind you, but the majority of the Electrosphere experience has been available to players for quite some time now. However, in 2023, we got a new patch from a group called Loadword Team, which features an entirely new translation from the ground up that uses the original script that's not just in English, but is also available in Italian and Spanish as well. This also includes sections that were previously untranslated, such as the news and web bulletins, and even touches up some of the story segments to remove Japanese characters in the background, making it the most complete version of Ace Combat 3 we've had yet. But I think the most impressive part of the translation is all the additional things that released alongside it, including a full translation of the manual, a fan sub of the Ace Combat 3 VHS dubbed Mission 00, and probably my favorite inclusion, a translation of the supplementary Appen disc. You see, in Japan, the Electrosphere soundtrack released on 2 discs, but the second disc in the collection could also be played on a PS1, and it includes a music player, the ability to watch any of the game's cutscenes, well, as long as you have the actual Ace Combat 3 disc to hand, a brief video showing you some of the game's experimental planes, and the ability to download a save file that gives you immediate access to all the game's missions and planes, as well as a few bonus planes that were exclusive to this disc. In other words, fans of Ace Combat 3 have never had it better, and I think it's a testament to the quality of this game and the passion of its fans that something like this even exists. It was clearly a monumental effort, and while I think pretty much all the Ace Combat games are really good, there's quite literally nothing else like Ace Combat 3 out there, so if you've still been sleeping on it all this time, it's time to wake the fuck up and learn about teletext via a cool in-game web browser. Next up, we have Addie no Okarimono Tomose from Addie, a late release title from Sony, and also a very cute one. This game had always caught my eye due to its striking watercolor visual style, but I never really knew what the game actually entailed, but thanks to this fan translation, now I do. And let me tell you, never has a game made me feel dumber than this one. What we have here is a lovely hybrid of adventure and puzzle game, kind of like Professor Layton in a way, only all the puzzles involve this device called a loglock, one of the most devious things I have ever encountered. The plot centers around the lovely Addie, a 9-year-old girl who gets gifted the loglock from her friend and then later awakes to find herself trapped in a dream world where the loglock seems to be the key to getting out of this dream world and also changing things in the environment to her will, an ability I'm sure all 9-year-old girls have. The puzzles effectively require you to change one word into another by twisting, rotating, and moving letters from one place to the next. It seems quite simple on paper, but the puzzles are all about doing this in as few moves as possible, and while this isn't too hard with smaller words, the game has plenty of tougher puzzles, which legitimately made me feel like a complete moron. Luckily, there are plenty of tutorials to get you up to speed, but believe me, don't let this game's cute aesthetic fool you. This thing is a hardcore puzzle lover's dream. Beyond that, the game has some wonderful visuals, including this little animated Addie on the right who mimics your actions in-game, and some lovely usage of sound cues for nearly everything that you do, whether you're walking or talking, everything is synced up excellently and adds so much to the game's charming and relaxing vibe. It certainly won't be a game for everybody and idiots like me, but it's another fine example of the wonderful gameplay and visual experiences that you can only find on the original PlayStation, and it's one that I'm very much glad is now translated and out there for people to enjoy. Next up, we have Call of Cthulhu Prisoner of Ice, which is another one of those Western games that originally saw a release on PC and then later got a Japanese exclusive console port because more people own consoles than computers in Japan. Well, like many other PlayStation games in this category, Prisoner of Ice is now fully playable in English on the console, and my god, is it a 90s adventure game. Originally released in 1995 and developed by Infogrames, Prisoner of Ice takes place in the run-up to World War II, and if there is one way to make World War II that little bit more dramatic, throwing some eldritch gods into the mix is a good way of going about it. The game kicks off on a British submarine after your crew stole a few crates from the Nazis, and what's inside those crates, you ask? Well, it's Cthulhu's boys, of course, and so begins a lovely mix of World War II adventure and Jesus Christ, don't let this weird demon thing kill me, the game. As a 97 PlayStation port of a 95 PC title, it works quite well. The animations are good, the story is pretty interesting, and the voice work ain't too shabby either. It's just, you know, a 90s PC adventure title, and as such, it's as confusing and obtuse as you'd expect if you ain't clicking on anything and everything and then using what you find on anything and everything. Well, good luck getting out of this submarine, let me tell you. If classic adventure games, World War II and Cthulhu are your thing, well then absolutely give this game a try. It's great to see another one of these patches make it to the console, and considering how many more games like this are in the Japanese PS1 library, I wouldn't be surprised to see a few more patches like this one down the line, so if anybody out there is in the mood to patch Darkseid 1 and 2, I'd greatly appreciate it. I mean, come on now, the people yearn for misery. Who's ready for some tactical role-playing games? Well, I hope you are anyway, because we now have a bunch of them coming up in a row. Starting with Ecsaform, a 99 release from Bandai and Imageworks, and a very bizarre game. Seriously though, this thing throws so many weird terms and concepts at you in the opening segments that you'll be equal parts confused and captivated, and if you don't believe me, the game has a whole second disc that features an index of pretty much everything in the game, and you'll probably need it too. Ecsaform's story starts out with a young girl named Ciceri, who is known as a noter, discovering a robotic being called Bede, and after a whole bunch of crazy stuff happens, the two of them manage to escape the weird facility that they've been held captive in, and it only gets crazier from there. Seriously, you visit a whole city that rests on the back of a giant bug. They ain't playing around. It's a very ambitious mixture of sci-fi and fantasy, and one that I really got into during its early segments. Now, I have heard the game's plot kinda takes a nosedive later into the game, which is quite the shame, but I do appreciate the scope of what they were going for here. Although with that being said, I think the main reason to try this game are the battles themselves, which from what I've played so far are the vast majority of the gameplay, as this is a rather linear battle heavy experience. It's the usual tactical fare you all know and love, but the game utilizes this interesting system where your unused action points can also be banked as a defensive shield. This makes for some nice risk-reward gameplay that I haven't really seen replicated in any other tactics game, giving Ecsaform a nice additional strategic layer to play around with. There are plenty of tactical games out there that do story, gameplay, and visuals better than this one, but it's also oddly captivating in a way few games are, so if you like your tactical games battle-heavy and a little bit weird, Ecsaform is well worth checking out, and if you don't like your tactics games battle heavy and weird, maybe the next one will be more up your alley. Say hello to Galaxy Fraulein Yuna Final Edition, an enhanced port of the 97 Sega Saturn original, and the third game in the Galaxy Fraulein Yuna series, which started all the way back on the PC Engine Super CD in 1992. And yes, Galaxy Fraulein Yuna 1 and 2 are also translated into English, so if you like what you see here, you've got a whole bunch of games to check out, you lucky devil. This series was created as a collaboration between Hudson Soft and artist Mika Akitaka, known for his work on the Gundam series and most notably MS Girls, which was a collection of girls wearing body armor in the style of popular mobile suits. Now clearly this rules, so Hudson Soft teamed up with Akitaka to create Galaxy Fraulein Yuna, a light-hearted magical girl series where the characters all get cool mech armor to wear. What's not to love? Now, amazing concept aside, the games are primarily a hybrid of visual novel and tactical role-playing game, kinda like Sakura Wars, but you know, without the dating sim elements. This means a lot of the game will be played from the visual novel style, and if you like your games story-heavy with lots of voice work and cool anime cutscenes, well then I'm sure you're already downloading this as we speak, but to its credit, the tactical battles are also pretty great. They're rather simple and feature nothing groundbreaking mechanics-wise, but the large roster of characters and colourful visuals are enough to make this a pretty fun, beginner-friendly tactics game in its own right. It's cute, it's fun, and it's got magical girls in mech armor, so if that sounds up your alley, well you've got a new favourite series to dive into, and if not, well, we've got one more tactics game to check out, probably the most obscure of the bunch, and one that comes to us courtesy of Santa Claus, of all people. Here's Goujin Senki, a game that was legitimately developed by Santa Entertainment. Now that might not be the real Santa Claus, but since nobody's ever seen him outside a shopping mall anyway, I'm just going to assume he's responsible for this. Now out of the 3 tactics games we've looked at so far, 98's Goujin Senki is probably the most traditional of them all, and feels very much like a PS1 era tactics game with all the bells and whistles that accompany it. Lovely 2D backgrounds, 3D polygonal units, a big map screen to stomp around, and some lovely CD quality music. You know, all that good stuff. And while it might not be as flashy aesthetically or conceptually as our previous 2 games, it definitely feels like the most fleshed out in terms of story and gameplay, at least from what I've played so far. The game centers around a group of rebels who are trying to stop a tyrant king who's acquired some mysterious ancient mechs that he's using to wreak havoc across the land, and from the get-go, the story's characters and their motivations are set up very well, immediately hooking you into the narrative and leaving you wanting to know more. And while it is a rather story-heavy game, It strikes a good balance between story and battles, giving us a nice mixture akin to something like Tactics Ogre or Final Fantasy Tactics, and it also allows us to replay battles to train up our units as well. Now the big gimmick for the battles here are of course the Goujin mechs, which your units can attune to and control from the inside, with certain weapons and magic being geared towards Goujin combat. Now it's certainly not the flashiest or most high budget game out there, but I love this mixture of mecha and fantasy, and out of all the games that I played today, this is the one that I probably invested the most time into, just because the story and battles really hooked me in from the get-go, and I also quite enjoyed the depth of systems that it had on offer. So yeah, 2023, a pretty good year for tactics fans, no doubt. But Sean, I hear you ask, where's the cool games where I can hit balls into bricks on repeat using a very small paddle? Well, worry no more, my friend, because your time has come. Next up we have Prism Story, and this one is rather odd. It's a fun little block breaker game in the vein of Arkanoid and Breakout, but with the crazy dial turned up to 11. Seriously, if you love multi-balls and one giant big ball, this is the game for you. But for as cool as a giant ball is, the odd thing about this patch is that this game did see a Western release, both in PAL regions as Prismland and in North America as Sorcerer's Maze, which has got to feature one of the funniest box art changes around. Seriously, this is the only thing they changed in the North American release, beyond adding this image to the main menu as well, but it is worth it to see one of the funniest zooms in gaming history. So why the need for a translation patch? Sure, the game does feature some light story, but I can't imagine it's the main reason people are playing this thing, and the story is also present in the PAL version, so what's the deal? Well, the answer lies in the save system, which is to say the Western versions do not feature one. Yeah, for whatever reason, the ability to save was just removed in these versions of the game, and since it's both longer than you'd expect and kinda difficult too, having a save system makes reaching the end a whole lot easier. So now, thanks to this patch, you can now play the game in English with the story segments intact and a fully functioning save system. What a time to be alive. Sure, you could probably just use an emulator and save states to overcome this issue, but for the hardware purists out there, conquering Prism Story is now easier than ever, and in all seriousness, it's actually a pretty good game, one of the best block breakers on the console in my opinion. So if you ever see this thing clogging up a bargain bin in a town near you, it is well worth picking up, especially the North American version, cause come on, look at this fucking guy. Next up we have Tripuzz, which unsurprisingly is a puzzle game featuring a lot of triangles. This 97 release follows the usual block breaker puzzle formula of the time, but the big gimmick here are the game's angular pieces. Connect 4 of these pieces together and they'll break. Connect even more together to score big points, and if you manage to chain even more colors together as a result of triangle shenanigans, you score even more points and cause massive amounts of pain to your opponent in the process. Classic puzzle banter. It's a formula I'm sure you all know and love, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't something incredibly satisfying about slotting all these triangle pieces together into perfectly shaped gaps. It just makes my brain feel good, you know? As for the translation, this time around we only have a partially translated experience. It covers the main single player mode, 2-player battle mode, and the usual solo mode that's included in these types of games, but unfortunately the puzzle mode, which is probably the area where you'd need a translation the most, is sadly untouched. But I won't lie, it's not that hard to figure out the menu options or what you need to do in this mode, so if you like what you see, I don't think the language barrier will cause you too much hassle. At least the patch makes the boss character selectable from the start in 2-player mode though, so that's pretty nice. If you're a fan of puzzle games, this is a very enjoyable and unique take on a classic formula, and one that I can easily recommend, whether patched or not. Plus, it's the only game where I've seen a cat kill a nun, so it's got that going for it. Well, I promised you a holy grail, and here it is. Ultima Underworld: The Stygian Abyss, a Japan-only console port of the highly influential 92-DOS original. Now, I'm gonna assume at this stage that you're all aware of Ultima, one of the most groundbreaking and influential series in video game history. Ultima, along with Wizardry, kind of set the standard for video game role-playing games in the early 80s, and almost every RPG from here on out has at least some of the DNA from these games in them, and while they were certainly quite popular in the West, Ultima and Wizardry were particularly popular over in Japan, helping to inspire games like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. If D&D was the catalyst of the role-playing game as we know it, Ultima and Wizardry are the video game equivalent, and we owe quite a lot to them because of it. Now obviously the legacy of these series is something too big to cover in a video like this, but if you know very little about them, it's what I consider mandatory video game history, and there are plenty of great videos out here on YouTube chronicling the series and its various games, but today we'll be focusing on just one: Ultima Underworld, a spin-off of the main Ultima series, and a game that managed to break quite a lot of new ground in its own right. The original '92 release was the first role-playing game to feature a fully navigatable 2.5D environment, and took place in a dungeon known as the Stygian Abyss, which features the remnants of a failed utopian society. Its non-linear progression, massive dungeon to explore, and complex systems led to the developers dubbing this as a dungeon simulation rather than a traditional role-playing game. And a lot of the systems that are here and the way that you can interact with and approach the game and its environments are what we would now know as an immersive sim. So in other words, this is pretty much the first ImSim out there, and it probably won't come as a surprise to see that Warren Spector was also the producer of this title, so the groundworks you see here led to the likes of System Shock and later Deus Ex, so you know, it's a pretty big deal. Anyway, here's the Japanese exclusive PlayStation port, which is a rather unique version in its own right because it was built ground up with console gameplay in mind, and not only that, it also features a brand new full 3D engine with new models and portraits to take advantage of the PlayStation's hardware, and let me tell you, it's pretty damn good. For the most part, it plays quite similar to other dungeon crawlers of its day. This PlayStation version in particular kind of feels like a long-lost Kingsfield game, which no doubt was also influenced by this thing. Create your character, explore the dungeon, beat up some monsters, collect items, level up, all that good stuff. But it doesn't take long to see Underworld systems in play. For example, one of the worst things that can happen in a dungeon crawler of this era is to be poisoned, and alas, if you fight enough giant spiders, it's bound to happen eventually. But not too long back before getting poisoned, I remembered exploring this cave and coming across some leeches, and I thought to myself, why on earth would I want to pick up some leeches? And lo and behold, a light bulb appeared above my head, and I dragged my poison ass back to these leeches, used them on myself, and they sucked the poison right out of me. And it was then that I understood that this game fucking rules. Now don't get me wrong, it's still a pretty old ass game mechanically, and I also don't think I've ever played a game where I've managed to get this lost. I mean, I just kept wandering trying to find my bearings in this dungeon, and it never ever seemed to stop. It only ever got more confusing, but that's part of the fun really. You meet interesting characters, make friends and foes, help some people out, do some trades, and bash on some giant rats. It's, you know, a classic. In the canon of PlayStation role-playing games, it's easily one of the most ambitious out there, and honestly a really well-made and accessible way to try out this classic, as even with the somewhat complex control scheme and commands, it's a very intuitive system that they've got going on here. If you do decide to play it, I would recommend trying it with this list of commands open beside you, but otherwise, yeah, it's a fun and unique port of one of the most important video games ever made. By the way, if you want to check out some of the Wizardry series too, which you should, there's a bunch of them on the PlayStation as well, which are also exclusive to Japan, but these two, which are compilations of the first 5 Wizardry games, feature an English text option out the box. It doesn't translate the spell names, and you might need to rename your characters when you start, but hey, it's 5 Wizardry games on the PS1 in English, so that's pretty cool. Anyway, we got one final game to round out this year's offerings, and it's the one where you get trapped in a house by your crazy uncle. Welcome to Welcome House, a game where you get trapped in a big wacky house by your uncle. That really is the entire plot of the game. Welcome House is a pretty early PlayStation release from a developer called Gust, who you might know thanks to all those Atelier games that they made. Well, this is one of their first ever games, and they refer to it as a polygon cartoon, which, honestly ain't that bad a description. It's basically a cross between Resident Evil and a slapstick simulator. You're trapped in a big mansion and you gotta explore and solve puzzles to get the hell out of there. The whole thing is essentially an elaborate April Fool's prank from your trickster uncle, and I gotta say, I really do appreciate the effort this guy put into making a house that is specifically designed to stress this guy out. The game features the usual array of fixed camera angles, but instead of pre-rendered backgrounds and tank controls, we have a lovely low-poly 3D house and some rather slow 4-way grid-based movement, but it does suit the game just fine. The core gameplay here isn't really anything more than finding items and keys to help you progress further into the house, but I won't lie, I beat this whole thing in one sitting and found it oddly enjoyable. Like, it is just walking around a weird house, but the developers really lean into the cartoony and slapstick elements of the game with lots of funny moments and an audience in the background that laughs and jeers as you succeed and fail. Plus, the main character's eyes pop out of his head when he gets hurt, so that's pretty cool. You can even find some vinyl records hidden throughout the house and play him in the jukebox in the bar, and it's legit got Doris Day and Beethoven in here, which I thought was a pretty fun addition.
When I was just a little girl.
Now, it's important to mention the translation here was done using ChatGPT, and it's something that I expect to see a lot more of in the future. Now, I'll be blunt, it's not a very good translation as there are a bunch of errors both in the script and on the graphical end, meaning it's really no better than a lot of the machine translations that we've seen in the past. Now, from what I gather, this was more so just a test patch to see how easy this would be to implement, so it's very possible that we could see this patch updated and tidied up in the future, so do keep that in mind. But if the goal was to simply make the game playable from start to finish, at the very least, I'd say that was a success. Now, AI is a pretty hot topic in the translation scene. As we've seen previously in this video, a lot of effort and pride goes into these translation patches, and while AI and machine translation can be a quick way to make a game playable, they can also often give people a poor impression of the game due to mistranslated dialogue, and even potentially prevent people from attempting proper translations in the first place, since, you know, people already considered the game translated, so why not put the effort into something else? I think a good example of this was in the last episode, where we looked at Popolocroy 1 and 2. The first game featured a full translation and really showed that one of the game's biggest strengths was its dialogue with NPCs, whereas the second game, which is completely playable, featured machine translated dialogue for NPCs and was more or less complete gibberish, which means you end up missing out on one of the features that makes this game so special. Then again, on the other hand, in a case where the story and narrative is quite limited or just flat out non-existent, and a game could benefit and be made playable from simply having some items and menus translated, I think that's probably where AI translations have the most benefit. Use it for a game that was likely never to get a translation in the first place, and I mean, Welcome House could very well be one of these games, since the limited dialogue that is here is not really enough to make a huge impact. But then again, how would I know, since I've never experienced the real deal? Food for thought, I think, but either way, I had a pretty fun time with Welcome House, and yes, if you're wondering, it is also quite similar to Goofy's Funhouse on the PS1, so if you like that, it's basically the same thing, minus Goofy, which will either be a positive or negative, depending on who you ask. Anyway, that's our last game of the list, but there is one more thing that I'd like to show you, because it didn't come out in 2023, but it is most certainly a fan translation. Some call it football, others call it soccer, but either way, there's a whole bunch of Winning 11 games from Konami that have translations that I never knew about, so let's talk about them real quick. Now, for those unaware, Winning 11, aka Pro Evolution Soccer, aka ISS, was for a time considered the creme de la creme of football games. I mean, I'm not even a football fan, but my friends who were big into football, but not video games, swore by these things. I mean, they wouldn't even touch a FIFA game for years, because this shit was just too good. And as it turns out, a lot of people thought the same way, which is why Winning 11 has probably more patches than any other console series out there. I mean, they'll be updating things like player names, team names, menu translations, and of course the addition of commentary for other languages too. Now there are 5 Winning 11 games on the console that have patches, most of them unfinished or partially translated, since by the time the patches were near completion, a new game in the series had already come out. But for the most part, if you want to play some of the latter Japan-only versions of this series on your PlayStation, there are patches out there to make things more accessible. So I thought I'd at least make you aware of their existence, because believe me, playing an old Pro Evo or Winning 11 game is a significantly better time than playing a modern football title, even the Pro Evo successor, which everybody hates because, you know, Konami. Anyway, that's all the games we have for today, and while it wasn't as many as last year's, keep in mind there was a time where we were lucky to get one of these a year, so we're still rolling in the good times, and long may it continue. Plus, if you look beyond the PS1, we got some major patches in 2023 worth checking out. I mean, there was Boko 2 on the PS2, we got Samurai Showdown RPG on the Neo Geo CD, which I've been waiting a long time for that one. We got Dot Hack Link on the PSP, and even Chocobo Land on the GBA. Freaking Chocobo Land, man. You love to see it. So if you ever think to yourself, damn, I got nothing to play, you better think again. And while nothing has dropped for the console in 2024 so far, there are some big ones on the horizon, like the Germs translation that was announced at the end of 2022, and I also believe there's a translation of Linda Cube, which is meant to be almost complete, so hopefully we'll be eating good in 2024, but only time will tell. So as always, I'd like to say a big thank you to the people out there who are making these games playable for us lowly peasant folk, so make sure to send them good vibes where you can. And as for what game I'd like to see translated on the PlayStation in 2024, well, last year I said Germs, and that seemed to turn out pretty well, so this time around I'd like to see a translation of Fox Junction, a cool mech game with an incredibly striking mixture of 2D and 3D visuals, and it also has a soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro, so, you know, that's gotta be pretty good. And my question to you watching this video, if you could pick one PlayStation game to be translated in 2024, what would it be and why? You never know, somebody watching might see your comment and get inspired. Probably not, but you never know. Anyway, that's the end of the video, so I'd like to give a huge shout out to my lovely Patreons for continuing to make videos like this possible, including fine folks like Adam Hartzell, Alan Caslin, Bloody Cassie, Callow Mello, Danny, Dave Nolan, Discun, the mascot for the Famicom Disc System, Doma, Fergal O'Hagan, Gerard Winter, Globe99, Howie, Icelight, Kyle Winter, Meester Papala, Moomin Biscuit, Trans Rights Are Human Rights, Mr. the Joshmon, Nathan McMullen, Richard Kramer, SN Kierstead, Spectre117, Tolkoto, and that Faye Bastard, who have all subscribed at the Fan++ tier. And finally, I'd like to give a big thank you to you at home or wherever you are for watching this video and checking out some cool games with me. I'll be back soon with some more PlayStation stuff throughout 2024, but until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll chat to you again real soon. See ya!